is Darlene Fairby. I'm the chair of the Department of English, and I am very pleased to be welcoming you to this first event in our colloquium series on literature. Our talk today is Dr. Lisa Ann Robertson. Dr. Lisa Ann Robertson is working on a book manuscript for Paul Grave that's called The Embodied Imagination. She's a specialist in 19th century literature and also works in the 18th century and primarily British literature. She teaches British Romanticism and 18th and 19th century British literature and culture, and oftentimes teaches the second half of the British Literature Survey for undergraduates. Her research interests are centered on the intersections of science and literary culture in Romantic era Britain. So that gives you some sort of notion of some of the approaches that she's most interested in. And Dr. Robertson's talk today is called Gothic Sensibility and the Rise of the Novel, Anne Radcliffe's The Italian. So please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you for coming out to the very first colloquium of the year, and I just want to reassure my colleagues who are coming after me that unlike Dr. McCormick last year, I did set the bar very low. Okay, so today I'm talking about Anne Radcliffe's novel, The Italian, and so I see a bunch of my students in the room, but I know some of you may not have read it, and so I put a plot summary up here for you. A baron or baroness, ignorant of their birth, and in some dependent situation, castle on a rock, a sepulchre at some distance from the rock, deserted room, underground passages, pictures, a ghost, so believed, or a written record, blood on it, a wonderful cutthroat, etc., etc., etc. So this was written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge to his friend William Wordsworth after reading The Italian. He read it in 1810. And even though he's being funny, in fact, his précis does capture sort of two important characteristics of Radcliffe's work. So first, he touches on several of the stock tropes that define Gothic as a genre. And then second, he notes Radcliffe's signature mood, which was an important intervention that legitimized the genre for critics, and that is a ghost, so believed. So I'll talk about Radcliffe's use of the supernatural today, and I also will review the plot highlights for those of you who need it. But I'm going to do this sort of as I go through my talk, and I'm going to be considering Radcliffe's work in relationship to the emergence of the novel as a genre, as a literary genre, and I'll be using The Italian as somewhat of a case study. So my talk is structured like this. So first I'm going to give a little overview of Anne Radcliffe as a person and an author. I will look at the critical and popular reception of her oeuvre as a whole. Then I'm going to talk about the rise of the novel, including some very important subgenres, which include amatory fiction, sentimental literature, the cult of sensibility, and of course the Gothic as a genre. And then I'll look at a couple of critical approaches. And I'm gonna, as I said, I'll discuss the Italian sort of sprinkled throughout, and I'm going to make the case, so the case I want to make is that the Italian combines elements of multiple genres, not only the Gothic, and that it does this to explore complex literary and social problems that were facing writers in the late 18th century. Okay, so Anne Radcliffe was actually one of the most critically acclaimed writers of the late 18th century. Her novels were wildly popular. The fact that Coleridge was reading it many years after publication attests to that. 18th century critics praised her, quote, poetic sensibility. They also liked her rich and sublime descriptions of the landscape and her, and quote, her tender but indomitable heroine. So this is putting Egypt here. And really, Anne Radcliffe's background is remarkable in just how unremarkable it is, and she's actually quite different from other 18th century and Romantic period women writers. So, just by way of contrast, Mary Wollstonecraft had a miserable childhood. She grew up in poverty after her alcoholic father blew the family's modest fortune, and she was constantly seeking the love of a mother who really only cared about sons. In contrast, Anne Radcliffe was the daughter of a London tradesman. The family had genteel family connections, and as a girl, she would visit her uncles in the summer, and she would mix with artists and writers of the period. Charlotte Smith's father married her to a ne'er-do-well son of a West Indian planter when she was 16. And she, like Mary Robinson, who was tricked into marrying a man who really couldn't afford a wife and children, she turned to writing to support her family after her husband's profligate spending landed them in debtor's prison. In contrast, Anne Radcliffe got married at the ripe old age of 23 to a man who eventually became the owner and editor of a newspaper, the English Chronicle. The couple didn't have any children, so she turned to writing as a way to pass the time with her husband's encouragement. So she wasn't really quite as prolific as many other 18th century novelists, perhaps because she wasn't driven by financial necessity, but she was so successful that she was paid £800 for the copyright of the Italian. So I'm going to put this in perspective, because £800 wouldn't even pay for a flat in London at this point in time, So Charlotte Smith was equally popular as a novelist and a poet. She also wrote some Gothic tales. She was paid about £50 per manuscript. And Jane Austen only got £10 for the first version of Northanger Abbey. So if I put this into today's currency, £800 equals roughly about 103,000 pounds sterling, or $133,000 in the US. And this is for one novel, so think about that, creative writers. So despite this success, Radcliffe retired from the literary scene when she was 32. She did continue to write until she died about 25 years later, but she didn't publish any of her later work. And this is despite the fact that she continued to be very popular and read well into the 19th century. So the full title of her last novel is The Italian, or The Confessional of the Black Penitent, a Romance. And this was published in 1797. So the subtitle might indicate where it fits generically, a romance, but its categorization is not quite so simple. So Gothic fiction is indeed closely connected to the medieval romance narratives that were imported from France in the late 17th century. And the Italian does sort of feature its own sort of twisted versions of love and chivalry and adventure. But as Fred Botting tells us, disapproving 18th century neoclassical critics failed to distinguish between Gothic romances and its sister, the novel. So critics found much to disapprove of in both. So even in 1797, the novel was a relatively novel genre, hence the name. And there are few instances of long prose fiction before the 18th century. So the Satyricon, written by Patronage in ancient Rome, for example. But aside from a few long exceptions here and there, the novel didn't really come into being as a genre until the early 18th century, and I can cite the year precisely at 1719. So in The Rise of the Novel, Ian Watts identifies the very first novel as Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which was published in 1719. But so sort of broadly speaking, Watts ties the emergence of this new form to two important cultural and economic shifts that occurred toward the end of the 17th century. The first was an epistemological revolution that was initiated by René Descartes and John Locke. And even though their theories of cognition, those of you who know me know I can't not talk about cognition, but the theories of cognition are very different, but what ties them together is both of them focus on the subject as an individual. So Descartes brought about a shift whereby the pursuit of truth is conceived of as a wholly individual matter, logically independent from the tradition of past thought, that I think, therefore I am. And then John Locke defined personal identity as an identity of consciousness through duration in time. So if you want to think about the literal subject, this is part of where it comes into being. Now, the way this plays out in novels, according to Watts, is that you now have characters, individual characters, who are involved in plots that depend on temporality, right? So, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. But now you have, characters who are not just sort of stock characters, and you have plots that move through time. The other important change was a change in technology that enabled the increase of printed ephemera. So you have periodicals such as the Tatler and the Spectator, which were daily and weekly magazines, and Watts says that they did much to form a taste that the novel would cater for. Another factor was the decline of the patronage system, so the nobility weren't quite subsidizing writers in the same way as they had prior to this point in the 18th century. So this leaves a gap for booksellers to fill. And so now you have the commodification of literature. What that means is literature, writing and printing literature becomes a viable way to make a living. So booksellers made a living off the print trade, and authors made a living off of writing and selling novels and poetry. Hence Charlotte Smith and Mary Robinson actually turning to authorship as a form of supporting themselves and their families. However, making a living, working for a living, was the purview of the lower orders. And so these authors and the tradespeople were part of the middling class that was starting to emerge at this time. The bourgeoisie, as they would come to call. And then there were more class changes afoot, which also affected the production of literature and created a market for the novel. And this was an increase in literacy among apprentices and domestic servants, especially footmen and waiting maids. So you have this whole confluence of economic and social factors that create the conditions for lengthy prose fiction texts to flourish. So Watts distinguishes novels from earlier forms of prose fiction, such as the romance. And he claims that the novel is new because it attempts a realism that didn't concern earlier writers, and he allies it with the epistemological shift that I talked about. So poets and romance writers tended to use stock characters that were placed in mythical and atemporal settings, and so they drew on universals, and in fact there was a sense, that there was a universal truth that sort of existed. I always say up here, but wherever that transcendental realm is, that's where it existed. Now we're moving more toward an experiential epistemology where we learn through our senses. So they drew on universals, conventional narratives, and sort of pre-established literary conventions. So originality wasn't necessarily something to be striven for. But novelists, he says, attempt to produce what purports to be an authentic account of actual experience of individuals using a methodology that aims for the ideal of objectivity. So this might sound a little strange, but the point is now we're moving towards imitation of specific life as opposed to imitation of life as a whole. So the novel form, he claims, was pioneered and established by Daniel Defoe, Samuel Richardson, and Henry Fielding. And so Watts' account of socio-cultural and economic conditions that enabled the novel to take off as compelling. It was what I was taught in grad school. It's what I teach in my classroom. Still largely accepted by scholars of the 18th century. But like much of literary scholarship before the 1970s and the 1980s, its focus is kind of narrow. So claiming that the defining feature of the novel is realism and tracing its origin to 3 male authors overlooks this entire literary tradition that grew up alongside of the realist novel. And it's a tradition that drew on it, and it's a tradition that competed with it, and it's a tradition that's equally responsible for pioneering and establishing the novel as a genre. This is according to Maureen Harkin, but I agree with her. So in 1719, Eliza Haywood published Love and Excess with Fatal Inquiry, and its subtitle, you can see, is a novel in 3 parts. And so this is the same year that Defoe publishes Robinson Crusoe. And Haywood's novel was every bit as popular as Defoe's, and it sold as well into the early to mid 18th century. So both were very popular, both were published many times, went through several editions, but it's gotten a lot less attention from the critics, even though I think it sounds a lot more interesting. So Love and Excess tells the story of a man who was pursued and wooed by a host of women over the course of his life. But because of social conventions, the women can't really openly pursue him, so they have to do things like write anonymous letters and hope he figures out which one it is. And basically for them it's a waiting game to see whom he will choose. So Highwood's novel explores different forms of female desire through this varied cast of female characters. It also illustrates the way that female desire is silenced and obscured by the social norms. So on the one hand, and we also have a lot of sex in it, so on the one hand we have amatory novels that focus on female sexual desire, and then on the other hand we have an illustration of man as homo economicus, which is how people typically see Robinson Crusoe, start of capitalism and all that. But it seems to me that both of them are important to literary history, yet one has been systematically overlooked. So Watts doesn't think that Haywood's novel is a novel, and he doesn't actually think that anything written after the 1740s and 50s are worth that much. So he says, after Richardson and Fielding, the novel gained an increasing importance in the literary scene. But the fiction of the last half of the 18th century, though occasionally of some interest as evidence of the life of the time, had little intrinsic merit, and much of it revealed only too plainly the pressures toward the literary degradation. Okay, so most of the novels I read and study were written during this period by men and women authors, so you can probably guess that I disagree with a lot. So I don't actually think it's productive to think about the development of the novel as a binary opposition between realism and everything else, because that approach really just ignores everything else. So it makes more sense to think of literary history as Maureen Harkin describes it. So she says that the literary field at any time is more of a struggle of multiple possibilities, styles, and subgenres. So the second half of the 18th century was in fact an equally exploratory period as the decades of the 40s and the 50s. This was all sorts of subgenres emerged, and this was as authors were experimenting with form. So it was now possible to tell long and involved stories in prose. And so you have questions like, what does this enable writers to do? How are you constrained by this form? And what are the formal challenges of this genre? So there was a lot of experimental novel writing happening at this time. So rather than sort of dismiss novels that don't make realism their primary aim, what we might do is we might think about them as, and again quoting Harkin, separate, complex, and compelling solutions to the diverse literary and social problems facing writers in the period. So one of the problems with the marginalization of these other modes of fiction is that it prevented critics from seeing and understanding their literary value. So, they have essentially the whole tradition of critics that have taken it on faith that they just don't have any literary value, except as curiosities that might reveal, what life was like during the period. But one value of these neglected, and until recently, things are changing, novels is that they inform the literature that critics have deemed worthy of canonization. And I might argue that they continue to inform literary and artistic conventions today. So a lot of tropes from these forms you still see playing out in television and movie shows and different kinds of genre fiction. So Radcliffe's work has been significantly influential in developing the Gothic as a tradition that persists today. I mean, if you read one of the resources of Bodies of Gothic, it goes all the way up to the 21st century, I believe, or at least the 20th, not the 21st. So I argue that it combines elements from novel forms that have been marginalized by Watt and his descendants, and forms that are still often marginalized outside of 18th and 19th century British literary scholarship, and I'm going to use the Italian to support my claim. So the subgenres that Radcliffe draws on are amatory fiction, such as that produced by Eliza Haywood, the sentimental novel, novels of sensibility, and then of course the Gothic romance. So starting with amatory fiction. So Catherine and Grassi explains that early 18th century amatory fiction explores, quote, the difficulties that women had negotiating the real and symbolic economies that characterize the patriarchal society in which they lived. And furthermore, it had a tremendous influence on the development of the genre that we now recognize as the novel. And Tony O'Shaughnessy Bowers tells us that, in fact, amatory fiction is not bound together by formal similarities. So it's not the fact they don't all look the same, right? They all have different kind of forms and have different sort of conventions. But there are two characteristics that do hold them together. And the first one is that amatory fiction is consistently used by critics as a kind of negative space. So it's insignificant, except as it helps define the privilege category novel, from which it is always excluded. So I think here we have a classic example of the way women and women's works is used to define what counts as legitimate by being an example of what is not legitimate. And then the second characteristic, so I told you we have a lot of sex, amatory fiction is salacious. But unlike Love and Excess, amatory novels typically follow the fortunes of innocent young women who are seduced by older men, usually a guardian or a relative. It's the age-old plot. He promises to marry the protagonist, but inevitably, she says yes, and then he casts her aside after he has consumed her sexually and has satisfied his male desire. So we can use, in Grassi and Bauer's definition of amatory fiction, to consider it an important precursor to Gothic fiction. So Gothic novels often feature a persecuted young woman whose chastity, or in the case of the Italian, whose life is being threatened, usually by an older predatory man. Okay, plot summary time. So, in Radcliffe's novel, the protagonist is an orphan, Helena, a presumably low birth, and she catches the eye of Vivaldi, a young nobleman who immediately falls in love with her, even though she's wearing a veil, you can't see her face. Is that sexy? So the threat to Eleanor is not actually posed by her suitor, but by his mother, the haughty Marchesa, and then his mother's confessor, the ambitious monk Schiavone. So in an effort to stop the match, which of course would be degrading to the Vivaldi family, the Marchesa contracts with Schiavone to kidnap Elena after he poisons her elderly aunt and guardian, Signor Bianchi, and to spirit her off to a sinister convent in the mountains. Once she's there, Elena refuses to submit to the abbess's demands to choose between marrying a man of her own station or taking the veil. So here we can see one way that the Italian explores the precarious position of women in the real and symbolic economy, the economies of the patriarchal society. So women in positions like Elena faced the unpalatable choice between marrying a man that she might not love, or a life of solitude, sort of dependent upon the charity of family members or rich old widows. I guess if they were Catholic, they could choose to take the veil, but usually if you're a Catholic in England, you cut that down low. So a young woman without parents or connections was especially vulnerable, right? So to support themselves before they meet Vivaldi and before she's whisked away to a convent, Elena and her aunt make lace and they do needlework that they sell to a nearby convent. So this is pretty poorly paid work, and it's really tedious and time-consuming work. Mary Lamb writes a whole essay about needlework in 1814, which is talking about contract workers. Furthermore, it was considered demeaning for women to engage in paid labor if they weren't already servants or of the working class. So Elena's poor status really makes her an easy target for abduction. So even if Signora Bianchi wasn't dead, there certainly wouldn't be any money to go looking for her, right? So she represents a class of women who could disappear and nobody could do anything about it. Okay, so back to the convent. The abbess is, of course, cruel. And so Elena withstands her cruelty, but she does it with the help of the only kindly nun of San Stefano, Olivia. And Olivia is very different from the other coarse and revealing nuns who live in the convent. She is a woman of exquisite feelings. She's quick to sympathize with the sufferings of others and even quicker to alleviate it. Both Olivia and Ella are women of sentiment and sensibility. So Watt dismisses sentimentalism, yet sentimental fiction was also allied with philosophical and scientific paradigm shifts in the period. So Janet Todd explains that sentimental literature uses pathetic and sensationally moving elements involving domestic relationships and distressed virtue. So sentimental literature is very closely allied with moral philosophy, which was advanced by philosophers of the Scottish Common Sense School, people like Earl Shaftesbury, Adam Smith, and Francis Hutchinson. And it's predicated, so sentimental literature and moral philosophy is predicated on, quote, the belief in the natural goodness of humanity that manifests a humanitarian concern for the unfortunate and the helpless. So it's a theory about human nature. And the other thing that sentimental authors did is they were actually working on an assumption that literature and life were directly linked, right? These weren't separate things, but in fact there was a direct connection between life outside of the pages of the novel and life inside of the pages of the novel. So literature then functions as a pedagogy, and sentimental literature functions as a pedagogy of spectacle and sensation to elicit sympathy, because they also believe that feeling sympathy was thought to be in and of itself sort of morally edifying, right? So apparently, presumably if you sympathize with someone, you're not going to do unpleasant things to them. So novels of sentiment were overtly didactic in aim, and they promoted virtue in both women and men, and they also modeled appropriate responses to situations, a range of situations, suffering animals, starving children, destitute old men and women, prostitution. So basically the various social ills, you would read these novels and know how to respond. They also encourage benevolent action as a natural reaction to sympathetic feeling. And typically they would feature a tableau, a written tableau, that described heart-wrenching scenes as well as the tears and the sobs of the spectators. And their protagonists, such as Henry Mackenzie's Man of Feeling, and this is an image from that, were hopelessly naive. So, instead of making the realist claim, this is how things are, the sentimental novel says, in effect, this is how it is to feel. So two different epistemological approaches. The literature of sentiment and the literature of sensibility are very closely related, and critics agree that Samuel Richardson inaugurated the cult of sensibility with his first novel, Pamela, or Virtue in Distress, which Watt considers to be in the tradition of realism. Novels of sensibility were closely allied with medical theory, with the new nerve theory that was formulated in advance by George Shane, who was a Scottish physician and also happened to be really good friends with Samuel Richardson. And so sensibility of the nerves referred to their innate sensitivity or their susceptibility to external stimuli. That's the medical definition. And just as a side note, Shane, who's Scottish, calls it the English malady, this oversensitive nervousness. But soon the word sensibility came to denote the faculty of feeling with a capacity for extremely refined emotions and a quickness to display compassion for the suffering. So this is how it's connected to sentiment. Now, of course, some people have more delicate nerves than others, and hence the cult of sensibility was born, and it was comprised of sensitive souls who cried or swooned or fainted at the merest hint of cruelty. Yes, we have a very good demonstration happening in that. Okay, so by 1770s, the cult of sensibility is in decline, right? Like it was a 20-year flash in the pan. 20-year flash in the pan. Then by the 1790s, authors were claimed to reject the conventions of the genre. So it goes from being all the rage to kind of being something that people laughed at to then kind of being something that people were embarrassed about. But even though, authors were like, me, no, I don't do that. But Gothic fiction, such as the Italian, does continue to use the sentimental contrast of virtue and vice, and often sensationalizing or sexualizing those elements, even though it wasn't meant to be overtly didactic. And really, the Italian does, I'll talk a little bit about how Radcliffe felt about sensibility, but the Italian does draw on its convention. Radcliffe gives us many, many pathetic and sensational themes, that are calculated to provoke or evoke a sympathetic response in the reader. So one example is Elena's first meeting with Olivia in a convent, right? It's marked by tears of gratitude. So melting under the sympathetic glances of Olivia, Elena explains, "You have a heart that can pity, though you inhabit these walls. You have suffered too and know the delicate generosity of softening the sorrows of others by any attention that may tell them of your sympathy. Oh, if I could express how much the sense of this affects me." Tears interrupted her. So the other thing is that only virtuous characters exhibit this kind of delicacy. If you were evil, you were not sensitive, you had no sensibility. So the Marchesa is very haughty and unfeeling, and the only time Schedoni trembles is if he fears one of his heinous deeds might be exposed. But the noble Vivaldi also possesses fine feelings and a sympathetic imagination. And again, another quote from the book. When he thinks about the wrongs that Elena had already sustained for his sake, he suffered a degree of generous indignation and a succeeding tenderness that almost melted him to tears. So this, Vivaldi, is a man of feeling. Not quite so naive. So eventually, Vivaldi rescues Elena from the convent, of course, right? But on their flight back to Naples, they're intercepted by Schedoni and his evil henchman. Vivaldi gets hauled off to the Inquisition. Elena is taken to a forsaken seaside house where she is to be murdered. And as Schedoni is about to plunge the dagger into sleeping Elena's chest, he's arrested by a locket around her neck because it contains a picture of him. It seems that she's a daughter whom he believed to be dead. Back at the Inquisition, Vivaldi's suffering a very different fate. He's being repeatedly dragged before the tribunal. He's repeatedly declaring his innocence, and finally, he's visited by a mysterious monk who glides through walls and appears and disappears without warning. "Tremble," said the voice close to his ear, which he instantly knew to be the monk's, and which suddenness of which electrified him. Yes, this is the very same monk who accosted him in the ruins near the abbey and issued a dire warning to stay away from Elena. "Go not to the Villa Altari," it solemnly said, "for death is in the house." So in the Inquisition, this ghost monk gives Vivaldi information to free him. Okay, so this probably seems a little fantastic, right? Not much of a realist novel, but it's pretty standard in the genre that came into being during the Gothic revival. So if novels of sentiment and sensibility say this is how things feel, or this is how to feel, Gothic novels say this is how things feel in a world that is baffling, constricting, often inexplicable, and largely out of our control. So the term Gothic, of course, originally refers to the Goth, which is a Germanic tribe, but eventually came to signify the medieval period overall and the type of architecture associated with it, which were buildings that are sort of characterized by a pointed arch and vault, which spread throughout Western Europe between the 12th and 16th century. You have an image of it in this, you can see an example of it in the picture from the Old English Baron, and you might notice that my background and my slides are of that type. The Gothic revival was marked by antiquarianism, the vogue for the graveyard school of poetry, and intense interest in the sublime. So in the midst of the Enlightenment, people are beginning to take an interest in the Dark Ages. So Enlightenment reason, of course, promises to shed light on all the mysteries of nature, right? To bring about a better society through the strict exercise of reason and to banish all confusion by categorizing things nicely and neatly, get everything sort of in control. So in the midst of this emerges a fascination with darkness, with secrets, the unexplainable, and the supernatural. And the first Gothic novel to be published was in 1764, and it's The Castle of Otranto, which was written by Horace Walpole. So unlike Radcliffe's The Italian, which takes place in the 18th century, it's set in the medieval period, and it has many of the tropes that would become stock features of the genre, subsequent Gothic novels. So it has a family curse. It has a haunted castle that is filled with secret passages and dungeon rooms that have low characters who don't know that they're noble. There's a creepy old man who's trying to seduce an innocent young woman, often by force. And of course, you have supernatural occurrences that cannot be rationally explained. So this new form of fiction just took off like wildfire. So you have men and women alike who are publishing Gothic fictions, and I have a little list up here. So people like Claire Reeves, Sophia Lee, William Beckford, and of course, Gothic romances were regarded, they were regarded with suspicion by the guardians of good taste. Because they emphasize the sensation and the supernatural. So Radcliffe was really important in the reception of the Gothic, because this is not highbrow form. This is a lowbrow form. But her intervention in literary Gothic was to bring it into the mainstream. She made it a respectable genre. And so how did she do this? She did this by retaining all of the elements that make it appealing. So the terror-inducing supernatural events, the mystery, the plot twist. But by the end of Radcliffe's novels, supernatural events are all rationally explained. So a ghost, or supposed. So in contrast to Walpole's Castle of Otranto, so I'm going to give you some endings of other Gothic novels. In the Castle of Otranto, an ancient prophecy is fulfilled when a huge helmet crushes the castle lord's only son. In Matthew Lewis's The Monk, the evil monk Ambrosio makes a deal with the devil in the closing pages, and it ends with him impaled on a rock, tormented by vultures. In Charlotte Dacre's of Floya, the protagonist plunges into hell in the last few pages of the novels after agreeing to marry Satan. She didn't know she was marrying Satan, but wrong choice. But in all of Radcliffe's novels, the dark medieval inflected world is happily returned to modernity. All the fears are vanquished by Enlightenment reason. So it turns out the mysterious monk is not a ghost. He's a member of Skidoni's monastic order, which just happens to be pretty adept at sort of walking quietly. He knows all the secret passages and trapdoors. And he counsels Vivaldi to call for Skidoni's arrest. So this is the information that eventually frees him. So Skidoni's arrogance and pride had made his fellow monk angry, and so the monk wants to make him pay. Skidoni, of course, is not innocent. So his deathbed confessions are pulls together all these bits and pieces of mystery that have been sprinkled throughout the novel, typically in interrupted tales by servants in the form of rumors or sort of ghost stories, because like nobody wants to listen to servant stories going on and on and on. It turns out there's a whole story all along. All these get sort of pulled together. So it turns out that Skidoni was the profligate younger son of a count who squandered away his inheritance. So naturally, he murdered his older brother to get his lands and titles, and then he forced his brother's widow into marriage. She wasn't too happy about this, so he's jealous of her, and so in a jealous rage, he kills his wife/sister-in-law. Then he joins a monastery to escape his crime. I'm not going to talk about like what this novel does with Catholicism. It's a whole different talk. So even though the Italian draws on these conventions of sentiment and sensibility and the Gothic, Nelson C. Smith tells us that Radcliffe was far from being an advocate of sensibility. So really, her novels warn against the danger of excessive feeling and an overactive imagination. So she legitimized the Gothic by privileging rationality. So the fascination with the dark side of the enlightened binary is really not that surprising. So psychoanalytic critics, shall I see it, have argued that Gothic literature provides a way to work out unconscious fears about uncanny, the return of the repressed, or the dark residue of trauma. The Enlightenment promised to explain and categorize the world, to shine the light of knowledge on everything, but there was still this fear that the world cannot be contained by taxonomies, and that there's always some dark secret corner or chamber that hides a lurking monster. Now, feminist critics argue that for women authors, these dark corners of society can be found in the domestic sphere. So the patriarchal home often functioned like a prison where women were confined whether they wanted to be there or not, and sometimes with husbands who were cruel and violent. So it's really a critical commonplace to read the cramped cell, the suffocating dungeon, or the claustrophobic sepulcher as a metaphor for the oppressive and restrictive conditions of women's lives. So women were required to marry for economic survival, and they were often prevented from entering the public sphere. But as I like to point out, novels are kind of a sneaky little way to bypass that restriction because they're very clever. But the focus on the domestic as a repressed site of trauma is one of the common features of women's Gothic writing, or what very early feminist critic Ellen Morse calls the female Gothic. So another difference between the female and male Gothic is that male authors used horror to evoke fear, while female authors used terror, and I'm not joking, Radcliffe was indeed called a terrorist, but it meant something a little bit different than it does today. So Fred Bonney explains the difference. So horror, quote, freezes the human faculties, rendering the mind passive and immobilizing the body, where terror activates the mind and imagination, enabling an overcoming of fears and allowing the subject to move from a state of passivity into activity. And in the Italian, Elena is literally moving across the landscape, from Naples through the mountains to the seaside, back to Naples. So according to Morse, for Radcliffe, the Gothic novel was a device to send maidens on distant and exciting journeys without offending the proprieties of the day. So Elena does what no respectable woman could do outside of the pages of the novel, and she's not even considered shocking because it's against her will. Okay, so now, back in Naples. Back in Naples, Eleanor reunited with Olivia, who's been transferred to a nearby convent. This is a nice convent with more like a sisterhood than a bunch of mean old ladies. So when Eleanor, the old servant, visits, she recognizes Olivia. Olivia is Eleanor's mother, long believed dead, and Scudroni is not her father. The other brother was, so that's kind of a relief there. So Olivia she was wounded, but she wasn't killed, but she fled to the convent in the mountains to escape spousal abuse. She sent her eldest daughter with the servant, the very one who recognizes her later, to her sister, Signora Bianchi, and Scudoni's daughter, I guess, just died, so there's that, never really mentioned. But as a daughter of the Count of Bruno, Elena is of noble birth and she can marry Vivaldi without disgracing the family. So a novel ends with marriage, as so many Gothic novels do. So not only is enlightenment reasons is restored, but so is the patriarchal order, and I might add the class hierarchy, which is probably why she was so successful with her critics. But before we dismiss Radcliffe for her conservatism, it's sort of worth looking at the Italian through the lens of queer theory. So, the Romantic period was pivotal in the transition from the one-sex model to the two-sex model of sexual difference that came to underwrite what we know today as modern gender binaries. But in the period before they were stabilized, women authors used novels to explore non-binary conceptions of gender. And Jacqueline Body argues that for writers like Smith and Robinson, they depict gender as unfixed and fluid in their representation of male and female characters. So men and women in these novels react very similarly to events with tears, this is a quote, tears, fortitude, restraint, and enthusiasm. And men exhibit excessive emotion as part of their manliness, and women's sensibilities characterized by strength and autonomy. Oh, the 1790s. So though Lavi doesn't discuss Radcliffe, I think that her argument applies to the Italian because Vivaldi is consistently portrayed as suffering from excessive sensibility and overactive imagination and all the susceptibility that comes along with that. So late in the novel, in Withering Inquisition, Scudoni tells Vivaldi that the ardor of his imagination was apparent, and so that is what allowed the monk to avail himself to Vivaldi's prevailing weakness, a susceptibility which renders him especially liable to superstition. The other thing is that Vivaldi, all throughout the novel, suffers from these sort of over-emotional fits. Elena, on the other hand, remains calm and rational throughout. So this is just a little bit of dialogue that illustrates that. So this is Vivaldi. Ah, Elena, did love ever exist without fear and without hope? Oh, never, never. I fear and hope in such rapid transition. Every assurance, every look of yours gives force to one or the other that I suffer unceasing anxiety. No, Elena, how calm, how indifferent, how circumspect, how prudent, exclaimed Vivaldi in tones of mournful reproach. Why will you persist in such self-infliction, said Elena. So Elena is consistently described as calm, resolute, as commanding self-control, Quote, "She was never so far from committing herself to indulge in any useless expression of anxiety that she never appeared otherwise than tranquil. And when she faces danger, she, quote, prepares her mind to meet it with fortitude and most strenuously endeavors to attain the strength of mind which was necessary to support such equanimity." So Elena and Vivaldi do exhibit sexual differences that are predicated on political and economic circumstances. Elena is modest. Vivaldi can move freely throughout Naples or beyond without a chaperone, but still it's a female character who represents enlightened reason. And her male foil represents excessive sensibility and irrational superstitious belief. So, despite Ian Watt's condemnation of novels that don't aim for objective realism, critics and readers loved Radcliffe's novel. The Italian did receive less praise than her other novels, but it was mostly because reviewers were focusing on the merits of her work. By this point, by the end of her career, she had a number of stock tropes, and I'm assuming she just retired because she didn't want to be a one-trick pony. Also, she had tons of money. But her novels do provide a case study that challenges Watt's claims. So combining elements of several emergent subgenres, Radcliffe shows how literature wrestles with the problem of form, not only to delight, but to imitate and to instruct. Like amatory fiction, Radcliffe builds a world that is experienced by women, and though they're set in exotic locations with fantastical plots, the Italian builds a world where women remain vulnerable to abduction, economic insecurity, and domestic violence. And like novels of sentiment and sensibility, the Italian instructs, even if Radcliffe's values are different from sentimental literatures. She dramatizes the effects of irrationality, overactive imagination and superstition, as well as the benefits of reason and rationality. She explores culturally contested issues such as appropriate personality traits for women and men. And finally, she legitimizes Gothic novels by restoring the dark world of terror back to the safety of Enlightenment values. So it's not really clear to me why critics dismissed 50 years in the development of novels. Maybe it's because so many of them were written by women, but not all of them. Maybe it's because the 20th century was largely embarrassed by emotion. You can just look at cybernetics and cognitive science to see that. And even today, we sort of view sentimentalism as pejorative. We don't, if we say stop being so sentimental, we don't ever say be more sentimental. So maybe we're just a little bit embarrassed by these kinds of novels. But Radcliffe's craft demonstrates an ability to manage multiple plots. You have no idea how much I left out. There's like a whole servant storyline, and yeah, my students are nodding, right? No, how much I left out. But she knew how to manage multiple plots and storyline. She knew precisely how to present information and include details that only later we discover are important. No detail is superfluous, and even her description of scenery informs character development. So Elena's response to the sublime is neither Burkean nor Kantian, rather she finds solace in straying into the uncontrollable forces of nature, which is part and parcel of Elena's character. So fortunately, the critical tides have shifted, and they continue to shift. In a recent publication, Gavin Budge considers, quote, Radcliffe as an ironic and self-reflexive writer. So the novels written during the latter half of the 18th century, so the novels written between the rise of the novel and the golden age of the Victorian novel, show the ways in which this new genre was put to use. They show the ways in which authors experimented with form. They also show the formal conventions that arose to deal with problems of representation and the limitations of language. So, you don't understand, 18th century novels by women might not be everyone's favorite beach reading. It's my favorite beach reading. I do hope that today I made some strides to convince you that the genres I've discussed, including the Gothic, are an integral part of literary history and well worth reading. Thank you.